The Gravitron. Remember the Gravitron? I do. Back when you were a kid or going to the local fair? The reason I wanted to talk about the Gravitron is because I actually find it to be a really helpful illustration as to why the whole official explanation of the Earth's gravitational pull versus the centrifugal force exerted by its alleged spin is something that just really falls apart very quickly upon examination of it. And I'm a pretty visual person, so I like things that can kind of help me visualize concepts being talked about. And the reason the Gravitron is such a good one is because on the one hand, it really does work as a pretty decent analogy for the explanation that we're given in terms of how the Earth's gravitational pull is pulling us downward towards the supposed center point of the spherical globe, or oblate spherical globe, whichever one you want. And then while the centrifugal force of the spin is, of course, centrifugal force throws you outward as you see when you ride on a Gravitron ride. It's these two forces working together. Like on the Gravitron, as it spins, the centrifugal force pushes you out against the walls, and so the walls could more or less be said to represent that force of gravity pulling you inwards. And so the two working together effectively balance each other out and hold you in place at the outer edge there. So, I mean, this is essentially the explanation that we're given as to how it all works on the spinning globe model. And so you have this perfect balance of these two simultaneous forces, supposedly. But of course, the main difference between the Gravitron and the globe is that the Gravitron is, of course, working on a plane. It's essentially a disc spinning in a circle, and it's not a ball. So, which really begs the question as to how that actually works on a globe. If everyone knows that supposedly the speed of the spin at the equator is over 1,000 miles an hour, 1,080 or whatever the exact number supposedly is, and even in the mainstream explanation, they will say that because the circumference that you're making at the equator is greater than you would be closer to the poles, that gravity is slightly more the further north or further south you go. However, when you stop and think about this, it just really doesn't make any sense, of course, because if the world is really a ball and really spinning on an axis, you could theoretically get pretty darn close to where that actual axis point would be on either the North Pole or the alleged South Pole. And if you were to do that, if you were to be standing within a few feet of that axis point, the amount of spin that you would actually be experiencing would be so slow. Even if you were to get within 4 miles of either one of the alleged poles, 4 miles of that axis point, 4 miles giving you a diameter of 8 miles, which means that you'd have a circumference of rotation of about roughly 24 miles. 24 miles over a 24-hour period would be 1 mile an hour. So anywhere within 4 miles of that axis point, you're going 1 mile an hour or slower. So if you compare over 1,000 miles an hour to 1 mile an hour or less, the difference is just so significant that it doesn't make any sense as to how the gravitational pull, which is supposedly being caused by the molten core pulling everything, that's spinning in the center of the Earth, pulling everything towards the center. You no longer have that centrifugal force counteracting that. So essentially, gravity should be of a ratio of 1,000 to 1 difference when you got to the poles, and you'd be incredibly heavy. It'd be noticeably different. You would barely be able to move. And so when you think about the fact that, airplanes obviously fly over the Arctic region and can fly over the North Pole. They say they can't fly over the South Pole because it's too cold, which that's a whole nother story, but that doesn't make any sense. But the idea that that the centrifugal force being so vastly different at the equator versus the poles, but that somehow doesn't have any bearing on the gravitational pull. I mean, you tell me, it just flies on the face of common sense. And not only does this apply to things like airplane flights or, people physically trekking across the North Pole, but you have things like satellites, which are supposedly, you have what they say are the geostationary satellites, which are all basically above the equator, and their explanation is exactly like the Gravitron, where they're in that sweet spot between the gravity and the centrifugal force, and that they just like basically hang there being pinned to that edge of gravity, like the gravitational wall. And that's the geostationary satellites, but with the other satellites that are orbiting, they're not staying in a fixed motion right at the equator. They're going above it and below it, and so the centrifugal force being exerted upon them would be even greater differences, because with the increase of altitude, that extends the circumference of every point. All right, so you're talking about vastly greater speed. And so how does a satellite, which is supposedly orbiting the Earth, go from being thousands of miles an hour of rotation to far less than that, and yet they are able to hold their altitude perfectly for years on end? I mean, it all flies in the face of centrifugal force. So hopefully that makes sense, because if we can understand the properties involved in a simple carnival ride, which we expect even an elementary school child to be able to comprehend, and yet when it comes to the globe, it all gets thrown out the window, and we come up with all this extra theoretical mathematics to explain away what we understand. You see how it's all a bunch of nonsense. The Earth is not moving. We're not on a spinning globe. Gravity is gravity. The downward force, whatever is causing it, is the same wherever you go on the face of the Earth.